All right, before we start doing any trig, I just want to talk about everybody's favorite thing, fractions. Fractions are friends, not food. Anyway, let's just talk about fractions real quick. So if I gave you a fraction and I said 8 over what equals 2? 8 divided by what equals 2? The what would be 4. 8 divided by 4 equals 2. But if I change this and made these the reciprocals, and I said what over 8 equals 1 over 2, because that's the reciprocal of 2 is 1 over 2. What over 8 equals 1/2? Well, half of 8 equals 4. So you'd still get 4. So no matter what the orientation of the fraction is, as long as you make both sides the reciprocal, you still get the same fraction. So we're going to use that today. So if you remember from last year, you would look at your reference angle, you would figure out what's opposite, what's the hypotenuse. So in this case, you would be using sine. Sine of 42 equals what over 13? Remember, the sine of 42 is just a very crazy decimal. So if you wanted to solve for x, you would multiply by 13. That would become 1. You would multiply this by 13. So if I did 13 sine 42, and remember, you want to make sure your calculator is in degree mode. So mode, scroll down 2, it should be blinking on the degree. Once you make sure it's in degree, 13 sine 42, so you get about 8.70. I'm going to say it's 8.70 because the 0 tells me I have more things, a lot more things here. So 8.70. Okay. Number 2, you have, this is your reference angle. Here is the opposite. Here is the adjacent. That means you have tangent. Tan 37 equals opposite over adjacent. Solve for y, so multiply by 10 becomes 1, multiply by 10. Just put this in the calculator, 10 tangents of 37. So 7.5554. All right, so now here's where we start to see this reciprocal that happens. And I know that in the past, there was a different way that you could solve it. So I'm going to let you solve it however you want. Whatever way you feel most comfortable doing, go for it. So here's your reference angle, 41. This is your adjacent, this is your hypotenuse, which means AH, you're using cosine. Cosine of 41 equals the adjacent over the hypotenuse. This is not a 9, it's a Q. Okay? Now, maybe in the past, you didn't want the Q to be in the denominator, so you multiplied this by Q, that would become 1. You multiplied this by Q. Then, to get Q by itself, you would divide by cosine 41, and that would isolate the Q. And then you would divide this by the cosine of 41. So in your calculator, you would do 13 over cosine 41. So the answer should be 17.23. I'm going to show you a different way to do it. So here was my original fraction. And remember in the beginning of this, I said that if you make your fractions into reciprocals, you just have to make both of them into reciprocals. Right now, this is over 1. Okay, so I'm going to take this, flip it over. I'm going to take this, flip it over. 1 over cosine 41 equals Q over 13. You want the Q to be isolated. So I'm going to multiply this by 13 and this by 13. Just make sure in the calculator you do this carefully. You want to take 13 times this entire fraction. So 13 times, I'm going to put this in parentheses, 1 over cosine 41. And you get the same answer, 17.23. Let me just do one more like that. I'm going to do number 7, where 80 is your reference angle, 17 is your opposite, x is your hypotenuse. Sine of 80 equals 17 over x. As soon as I see x in my denominator, I'm going to make it into a reciprocal. And then I'm going to solve for x by multiplying by 17 and multiplying by 17. Make sure you keep this whole thing in the parentheses. So 17 times 1 over sine 80 is 17.26. Okay, so these you can try by yourself. I'll put these answers up in the Google Classroom. Let's move on real quick to finding missing angles. So when you're finding the missing angles, you're trying to figure out what number would give me a ratio of 12 to 25 if 12 was opposite of B and 25 was the hypotenuse. How big would this angle be? And remember, when you're doing the angles, you're going to be using the inverse, which is that little -1. So all you're going to do for this is just put in the calculator sine inverse, so the inverse sine, 12 over 25. So second sine 12 over 25, 28.69. This one you would just do the inverse cosine of 4 over 5. $36.87. Okay, so that's if you are given the ratio. Most of the times you're not going to be given the ratio or the function. You're going to have to figure out which one you need to use. So let me do number 5 here. From x, you have the opposite and the adjacent. So you're going to be using the tangent of what equals 5 over 12. So what is the inverse tangent of 5/12? $22.62. I'll do one more and then you guys should be okay to try these and check them by yourself. Adjacent, hypotenuse, cosine. So what is the inverse cosine of 4/13? So about 72.08. Number 7, if you recognize this triangle, you're going to be in good shape come next week. If you recognize this triangle as being a very special triangle, because one of the legs doubled gives you the hypotenuse, which means that this angle right here has to be 30. And just for fun, this would be 60, and across from 60, if the short leg is 5, this would be 5√3. So we are going to need this moving forward. Remember, there's the unit circle where everything is based off the 30-60-90 or the 45-45-90, and you have to draw these little triangles. Remember, there's the quadrants. So that's all making a comeback. But for right now, go ahead, try whatever ones are left on here. Check those on the Google Classroom or with a partner, and then you can work on the worksheet that I just gave you. Make sure you check that as well for the answers.